Giovanni,
What?
it's not filming. It's doing something else. Where's
Trouble.
this isn't filming. It's just dotting. What the?
Should we tell me?
What do I have to do? Oh, tell him not to start.
Well, I'm replaying it anyway, but...
Oh shit! Oh, thank you, Giovanna.
See?
I started sweating.
Relax.
Yes, Giovanna said reboot.
Hey, when everything else fails, why? Don't you want to say it again?
But I just wanted to make sure that...
Morning.
So welcome. This is the first Friday forum. We're going to have several of these as the year goes on, and they're intended to provide additional material that goes with the regular lectures. In the winter, for example, we're going to have a performance of a scene from The Tempest. So these these will come to the Friday forum, and then also they'll be available online if you cannot make it. So today we're lucky to have three presenters from the philosophy department. They are seminar leaders in humanities core. They're both excellent instructors. And what they're going to do today is talk about Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment, and give you some philosophical methodologies. You're going to see how they approach this particular text. So our first speaker is going to be Dan Siakel, who received his PhD in philosophy from UC Irvine earlier this year. He also has 4 philosophy degrees, 2 of them from the University of Chicago. And his research focuses on metaphysics, philosophy of mind, early modern philosophy, and the history of 20th century philosophy. And most recently, he has been interested in doing research on Shambhala Buddhism and meditation. Dan is somebody who's very committed to improving his teaching, and as a result of that, he was a senior pedagogical fellow for UCI Center for Engaged Instruction. The second presenter is Valentina Ricci, who has 2 PhD degrees in philosophy. The first from the University of Padua in Italy, where she focused on German philosophy of the 18th and 19th century, particularly Hegel. Her second degree is from UC Irvine's philosophy department, where she focused on social and political philosophy, and her research was on ontology and ethics of violence. So as part of her philosophical work, she has strong interest in critical race theory and feminist philosophy, and you're going to see some of that in her approach to the material today. Valentina is also one of our humanities fellows in Humanities Core as part of a large grant that we got from the Mellon Foundation. So we're lucky to have her teaching with us this year. So I'm going to turn it over to them and let them give you this presentation.
So thanks to Rodrigo and Humanities Core in general for enabling Valentina and I to sort of demonstrate different aspects of the philosophical methodology for this morning. Just by a quick raise of hands, how many people have read the chapter in the Writer's Handbook on philosophical methodology and writing? Okay, excellent. So you're going to have a sort of head start for what we're going to do today. And what Valentina and I are going to do today is going to occur in 3 different phases. So in the first phase, that will be my task, we're going to aim to understand Kant's text. And I mean that in a quasi-technical sense, that is not just knowledge of propositions that Kant happens to assert, but also because we're doing philosophy, we're going to focus on structural relationships between the different claims that Kant is making. In particular, logical relationships, conceptual dependencies, etc. So that approach, when we try to understand first, is going to be systematic and focused on Kant's argument. For the purposes of getting that kind of philosophical understanding, we're going to bracket questions about history, etc. Not because they're unimportant, but simply because as philosophers, we generally have a slightly different focus than when we're doing literary analysis, rhetoric, etc. Okay? So then, in the second phase, after we first understand Kant's argument, Valentina is going to launch into another form of philosophical methodology, and that's critique. So that is to say, we're going to criticize Kant's argument. All right? This will then lead to the third phase, phase of today, where we engage in a philosophical dialogue with all of you. We hear your thoughts about the text, your questions about philosophical methodology, etc. Now, as a kind of meta comment for what we're going to do today, I'd like you to pay attention not only to the content of Kant's arguments and the content of what Valentina and I are going to present to you, but I'd also like you to constantly keep in mind how she and I and philosophers are approaching the text, because part of what we want to model today is just what we do in philosophy, that is philosophical methodology. So if at any point things are unclear or you have a question, please raise a hand and I will do my absolute best to address that. Okay, so let me start with a little factoid. In Kant's sparsely decorated home, he had only one portrait, and he put this portrait above the writing desk, where he composed some of the most significant and influential texts in the entire canon of so-called Western philosophy. Does anyone have a sort of guess as to who might have been depicted in that portrait? Sir? That might have been appropriate in certain respects, but it was not of himself. Any other guesses? So maybe someone you've been reading recently? Yeah, Rousseau. And of Rousseau, Kant said, I learned to honor mankind from reading Rousseau. Now, as you see in this slide, I'm going to highlight certain terms in red when I want to indicate either my or a philosopher's critical distance towards that term. And I'm going to highlight words in blue when I am saying that either I am trying to point out something important or I think that this element is crucial for understanding the positive content of the philosopher's argument. So you can track that as we work through this. So we're going to be focusing on Rousseau much more next week with Professor Steintrager, but if we have the kind of basics of Rousseau's view on the table, it's going to enable us to understand and more fully appreciate what Kant is up to. So let's start with some similarities, key similarities. Now here's my request. This PowerPoint is going to be disseminated to you after today, so please don't feel like you have to, and in fact I would encourage you not to write down what's on the slides. Rather, what I'd like you to take notes about are the thoughts that you have, potential challenges, questions that come up for you, what you think the essential points are. You're going to get all this, okay? So please don't invest your time and energy in focusing on that. You'll lose focus on the other things. Okay? So with that said, the first key similarity between Rousseau and Kant is that both take the analysis of human nature to be fundamental for practical considerations. And by practical considerations, I mean ethics, politics, the proper role of government, etc. Now here's the key idea here. Both Rousseau and Kant begin with the essence or nature of humanity. And they think if we understand the essence of what it means to be human, that's immediately going to tell us what would be the best and most just social structure. Okay? Their views about what humanity is, in its essence, is going to turn out to be very different, but at a general methodological level, they share this assumption. Secondly, both of them take freedom and not happiness to be the central ordering concept of practical philosophy. Now, Mendelssohn is a philosopher who responded to the same question that Kant did, what is enlightenment, in the month, I believe it was prior to when Kant's article was published in 1784, December of 1784. According to Kant and Rousseau, questions concerning happiness and human flourishing are dependent upon questions concerning human freedom. So we have to address freedom first, according to both of them, in order to understand what human happiness might amount to. Now thirdly, a third key similarity is that both Rousseau and Kant emphasize individualism and self-determination. So in this respect, as philosophers, both are going to accentuate the importance of autonomy, acting and thinking for oneself, which is indeed one of the hallmarks of the Enlightenment as a whole. So both stand in general agreement with philosophers working in the Enlightenment period on this point. And again, autonomy of the individual and self-determination is important not only for the individual, but also for the social contract and how we should order society to maximize human flourishing, to maximize freedom, additionally. Now this is related to a fourth point of similarity, which is that both in their critical modes, which we'll see modeled by Valentina in a few minutes, Both criticize basing one's self-conception, beliefs, and behaviors on others. Okay? So both are skeptical of valuing ourselves by being concerned with the opinions of other people. They think both that, and I had an interesting slip there, because I believe this as well, our self-concept should be generated primarily by how we self-conceive, rather than what the opinions of others have to be. Now, these points of similarities set up the crucial difference, and that is the following. Rousseau holds, unlike Kant, that reason is a derivative capacity necessitated by society, and he criticizes reason, society, and progress. Because we're going to hear so much about this next week, I don't want to dwell on it, but I would invite you to consider this quotation from the preface to the second discourse. There, Rousseau writes, "Meditating on the first and most simple operations of the human soul, I believe I perceive in it two principles that are prior to reason. This is what I mean by it being a derivative capacity, of which one, love of self, makes us ardently interested in our well-being and our self-preservation, and the other, compassion, inspires in us a natural repugnance to seeing any sentient being, especially our fellow man, perish or suffer." So again, for Rousseau, reason is not something that we have innately or essentially. It is something that results from our living in society. It is something that results from progress, and he's critical of reason, society, and progress. And I can say that in a different way in accordance with the following. For Rousseau, society, not the individual, is responsible for the fundamental vice of self-love. Now, please be very careful here. I'm drawing a distinction between love of self, which is something that Rousseau values and thinks is essential to being human, and self-love, which he thinks is a perversion of love of self. And by that I mean, to define my terms as you should in your own writing, a corrupt, competitive desire to be perceived as being better than others and envied. And here Kant is just going to disagree, because according to Kant, individuals, not society, are responsible for the fundamental vice of what he refers to as minority, and we'll explicate this a little bit more detail in a moment. But as a working definition, minority, according to him, is lacking the ability to use reason independently of others. Now, here are two things that I want to make sure you get before we proceed to look at the essay itself. Okay? For Kant, reason, there are two features we have to keep in mind. One, reason is innate. He thinks that it's a capacity that we are born with. Rousseau doesn't. Rousseau thinks that we acquire reason, or we have reason, only because we're in society. So that's the first important point. The second important point. Reason, according to Kant, is the essence of humanity. So it's innate, and it is the essence of humanity. For Rousseau, it's not the essence of humanity, it's rather a perversion of what's truly the essence of humanity. So that said, let's look at the first paragraph of Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment, from 1784. And as any good philosopher should, he defines his terms explicitly for us, and I want to pay attention to some of his language here. So he says that enlightenment is a human being's emergence from his self-referred minority, and the German word that's being rendered there is Unmündigkeit. All right? Before we talk about Unmündigkeit, could someone raise a hand and sort of give me an idea of why might I, as a writer, have put the word seek, the Latin abbreviation seek, after the word man, which I've highlighted in red. Any ideas about this? Right, this is a choice that I made for the presentation. Please, in fact.
Because it's your own interpretation, and that's how you're going to fight it.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I heard you adequately, but I think what I heard is the following, that I am using that to differentiate my understanding or my position, perhaps even my interpretation, from what an author says. When you use this little bracketed seek, it indicates that you are establishing distance between yourself and what is being claimed. Now, the reason why I do this is going to become adamantly clear once Valentina gives her critique. Now, the other thing here, notice this. Kant's conception of enlightenment concerns not just having reason, not just having understanding, but the use of it, the practical use of reason. So that's an important thing to keep on board. And here's the other thing I'd like us to appreciate. This word Unmündigkeit, it's been translated as minority. Here's some alternative renderings of it that really give us more of a flavor of what Kant is up to here, what's operating in the background, both for him and the people that would have been reading this at the time. Alternative translations include tutelage, immaturity, incompetence, and it can denote mental deficiencies. Now, at the time that Kant was writing, in addition to those translations, it's a term that also applied to children and what Kant refers to as, quote, the fair sex, end quote, who weren't allowed to represent themselves in legal contexts. Okay. So Enlightenment then for Kant is a willed rejection of self-willed minority, or Unmündigkeit. That is, Enlightenment for Kant essentially has to do with willing, deciding, resolving, acting, self-determining. And that enables us to appreciate the rest of this passage. He goes on to define minority, or Unmündigkeit, as inability to make use of one's own understanding without direction from another. So remember what I mentioned before about the importance that he places on autonomy? We see that in exactly the passage of this kind. He goes on to then define the other technical term that he employs in his definition, as a good philosopher should. And he says, this minority is self-incurred when its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in lack of resolution and courage to use it without direction from another. If you put those two technical terms together, you have a rigorous, precise definition of exactly what Kant means by enlightenment. But he also gives you an explication via Horace, who is a Roman poet, and in translation, that is dare to be wise. Now, Horace, any ideas about who might have been a friend of Horace, or what was going on in Rome at the time that Horace was writing? Okay. So Horace was a contemporary of Virgil, and Virgil actually spoke to Augustus to help support Horace and his lyrical poetry. So that's another interesting tie-in with him. And here Kant summarizes his view as follows: have the courage to make use of your own understanding. And he says that that is thus, given what he had said before, he's making an argument, the bottom of enlightenment. Now, to help us get a kind of cursory understanding on the page before we go into details about the argument, in What is Orientation and Thinking, written 2 years after What is Enlightenment, Kant explains enlightenment as the maxim of always thinking for oneself, thinking independently. It concerns a way of thinking, not what is thought, but how people think, namely independently, autonomously. And we get a further explication of this in the Critique of the Power of Judgment from 1790, where, ironically enough, Kant defines enlightenment as the liberation from superstition and prejudice generally. Now, I've written an exclamation point after prejudice because, well, I'll let Valentina explain that in a moment. So again, to underscore the point here, enlightenment concerns how, meaning the way one thinks. And now let's very quickly run through his argument for this position. Yeah, I had to throw in a terrible joke. All my students are saying, yeah, sounds familiar. Okay, so as you take notes during the following section, I'm going to introduce 4 key distinctions that help us understand Kant's argument. And here's the first one. Please make sure to get this, because this is some of the most important content we're going to cover in the understanding portion. And I'm going to ask you some questions about this too. First distinction between individually attained enlightenment, on the one hand, versus collectively attained enlightenment, on the other hand. Now, about individually attained enlightenment, Kant says that it's unlikely and it's difficult. Any ideas why? For those of you who have read this piece, why does he think that individual enlightenment is so unlikely and difficult to obtain? Why might he think that? Any thoughts? Please.
He's taking into account the society that necessarily does not want to be enlightened, I guess. And I guess the most important thing, because we have that going on about how society does not want to be enlightened.
So I'm not going to repeat exactly what you said, but let me know if I get the spirit of it wrong. The spirit of what you said, I believe, is absolutely correct. And that is within a social structure where enlightenment is not a virtue of the age, it's extremely difficult for an individual to act in an enlightened way simply because they don't know how. They don't know how to think for themselves. And in addition to what you pointed out correctly, is that within such a structure, think about anti-intellectualism as it exists in our country, for example, independent thought is something that is criticized by other people. So for that reason, the individual attainment of enlightenment is very unlikely and difficult. He thinks that publicly attained enlightenment is more plausible, but he also thinks that it has to go slowly. The risk is that people will just mindlessly adopt prejudices without having tested them themselves. And a second worry, remember at the time Kant is writing here, 1784, is that revolutions will occur where what ends up replacing social structure is just worse than what was there before. So collective enlightenment, according to Kant, has to proceed slowly. Now, this brings us to a second key distinction that Kant employs, and that is between the great thinking masses on the one hand, and in this same kind of bucket, he puts guardians that are incapable of enlightenment, Trump. And on the other hand, he talks about the world of readers. And he talks about independent thinkers belonging to this other category. These independent thinkers will be relative geniuses in their age, and I believe Kant would place himself and also Rousseau in this category. And here's my question to you now that we have a cursory understanding of enlightenment. Okay? What specifically would those geniuses, those independent thinkers, inspire in others? Would it be a particular doctrine? This is a real question. I'd like you to... Yes, please, Tanisha.
I believe that independent thinkers would be those people who not only express their opinion in society, but encourage others to express theirs as well.
Okay, excellent. So you bring us right back to the point that was mentioned before, that these geniuses, these independent thinkers, if they're acting appropriately, they won't want to make you think any particular thing. They're going to inspire you to think in a particular way that is independent, even if you disagree with them. Disagreement is not a bad thing on Kant's view. It's necessary. Okay? So here's the third key distinction that we need on board, and that is between constraint and freedom. Now, can someone tell me in particular what kind of freedom Kant has in mind here? Yes, please. Okay, excellent. So the gentleman in the front has rightly emphasized that for Kant, what's important is that freedom concerns the use of reason. Now, think about use of reason as it functions in the article. He gives us another distinction between uses of reason. Do you recall this? Which is my fourth key distinction, fourth and final key distinction. Anybody recall this? Sir, in the room? Yes, public use versus the private use of reason. Now, he uses these words in a bit different way than we tend to, so let me make sure that I clarify this point. The private use of reason, he means to pertain specifically to use in civil posts and offices, and he gives us three examples of that. The first is an officer following orders, the second is a citizen paying taxes, and the third is a clergyman broadcasting the dogma of his church. Now, when those people are functioning in their capacities of those positions, are they supposed to argue with the orders, not pay their taxes, not disseminate the dogma of the church? No. The public use of reason, the private use of reason for Kant means that when you're occupying a social post or office, you obey. But, here's the twist, now we move to the public use of reason. As soon as you're outside of that post or office, or you're not functioning in that capacity, when the officer is not on duty, it's not only permissible, but he should engage in argument and radical questioning of what he's being told while he's holding that office or post. Okay? Now, Kant has kind of a strange phrase for this. It refers to that distinction, the second one I mentioned before. In the public use of reason for anyone, you are functioning as a scholar before the entire public of the world of readers. And it is your duty not to obey in that capacity. It is your duty to argue, to listen actively, to have your own independent thoughts. So I think you all see how crucially important the public use of reason is for the Enlightenment. And there's two final things that I want to emphasize before I turn this over to Valentina and her critique, because we're still understanding. The first is that Kant's ultimate aim in using reason in its public capacity is for universal enlightenment. Elsewhere, he refers to this as the kingdom of ends. And he thinks that if the public use of reason is free, inevitably, humankind will emerge from self-incurred minority. That is to say, he thinks all of humanity eventually, slowly, but eventually, will become enlightened. His view, therefore, is a teleological one. That is a word where the Greek word telos means end or goal. And he gives you a conditional argument for this claim. If, on the one hand, the public use of reason is free, if that condition obtains, and that's the goal of the monarch like Frederick the Great, or the public to ensure that that's the case, and he includes that that's the second part of the conditional, universal enlightenment will eventually obtain. Now, there's one quote I want to read on this because he actually casts this at one point in the essay in barbarism. When we turn to Professor Lazo's set of lectures, we're going to be reading John Coetzee's book, Waiting for the Barbarians, and I want you to keep this in mind as we turn there. And this is on page, if you have this with you, page 21, about 12 lines from the bottom. And there he writes, people gradually work their way out of barbarism of their own accord if only one does not intentionally contrive to keep them in it. So you see here, this is that teleological dimension that I was indicating before. If reason is free, inevitably all of humanity will be enlightened, or so Kant claims. And so now that we have understood the general structure of his argument, we can turn to a critique of that.
Hello. Can you hear me? Through the microphone? Yes. I knew this wouldn't work. Now? Hello? How are you? Okay. Was that tired?
Honestly.
Okay. So, my aim in this portion of the lecture is going to be to challenge Kant's thoughts on enlightenment and to invite you to a reflection that does not only concern him or this particular text, but that extends to a more general question, one that has to do with what Said would call the politics of knowledge. So my question is going to concern in particular our relation to the canon. Does anybody know what the canon is? What the term means? Yes?
So like a list of books or like acting philosophies.
Yeah, so for each discipline, it is thought that there is a foundational, crucial set of texts and authors that one should refer to traditionally in the mainstream when one is dealing with that discipline or engaging in that discipline. So, as far as philosophy is concerned, Kant and Rousseau are definitely part of that canon and crucial. part of that canon. In fact, if you guys will take several philosophy classes, Kant will definitely show up in your readings. He had an immense influence on epistemology, the philosophy of art, ethics, political philosophy, and he's still right at the center of our research in philosophy. Not for everybody, but for a good number of us. So clearly it's not an accident we're reading this author and this kind of text. And don't get me wrong, there are very good reasons why this is the case. However, there are also controversial aspects about this author and what he writes in. So this gives me an opportunity to focus on issues that relate to the nature of philosophy and philosophical inquiry, and what this should imply. So as Daniel has beautifully expressed in his chapter on philosophical methodology, philosophy is radical, or at least it's supposed to be radical, in that it identifies and interrogates fundamental assumptions on which arguments, conceptual systems, and even entire disciplines depend. So radical here means that philosophical inquiry should question everything, should not take anything for granted, and should do so, by going to the roots of each problem. And if this is true, philosophical inquiry should do this not only to other disciplines, to others' arguments, but first of all, and most importantly, to itself, and without mercy. So, philosophy should be self-critical. And the way I would like to model this for you today is by looking at a particular passage in Kant's text and starting a discussion from there. So if you look at the second paragraph on the first page of your reading for today, more or less in the middle of that paragraph, Kant writes that by far the greatest part of humankind, including the entire fair sex, should hold the step toward majority to be not only troublesome, but also highly dangerous, will soon be seen to by those guardians who have kindly taken it upon themselves to supervise them. So, does anything sound disturbing in that passage? Yes?
The entire person.
Yes? Why is that disturbing?
This is reference to females,
Mm-hmm.
and he's differentiating. I say females and males when it comes to porn.
Yes, all of them,
Yeah.
right? And let's think about what he said before, right? We're just at the beginning of the text. He just defined enlightenment as a human being's emergence from self-incurred minority, where minority is defined as the inability to use one's own understanding without direction from another. That is, free. So, he's not only claiming that a majority of humankind is in this condition, already not super kind, right? He's saying that in that subset, large subset of humanity, all of the female sex is included. Nice, right? So, let us analyze this claim. I usually recommend my students, when they're writing, to be careful when using claims that start with all or every. Someone's nodding. And you know why? Imagine I say, all of the students in this room did the reading for today. How many counterexamples, how many exceptions does it take to disprove my claim? Yes, right? So Kant seems to be making, to begin with, a pretty bad logical mistake, right? At least worth of a C- here, right? But that's not only that. Most importantly, it seems like his claim is expressing prejudice. You remember we heard this term earlier in this lecture. Prejudice seems to be the opposite of what one should do and use and think in terms of when thinking autonomously, right? And by the way, this is not an exception in Kant's works. This is not the one claim that he was, made while, say, drunk. For example, in the observations of the feeling of the beautiful and sublime, beautiful work that unfortunately includes some of the most horrible things he said, woman's philosophy is not to reason, but to sense. It seems that rationality doesn't really belong to women, which in turn might imply women are not really humans if humans are defined by reason, right, and have reason innately. A woman is embarrassed little that she does not possess certain high insights, that she's timid and not fit for serious employment. She's beautiful and captivates, and that is enough. Also, man should become more perfect as a man, and the woman as a wife. Look at the parallel, right? And how that works. Unfortunately, gender is not the only theme where Kant miserably fails. He is regarded as one of the founding fathers of modern scientific racism. So the idea that races exist, that they have a biological basis, and that there's a hierarchy between them. So I'm going to spare you the most terrible quotes, and once you'll see the better ones, you'll be a little shocked. But anyway, in the hot countries, the human being matures in all aspects earlier, but does not, however, reach the perfection of the whites. Humanity is at its greatest perfection in the race of the whites. Right? The white race possesses all motivating forces and talents in itself. Therefore, we must examine it somewhat more closely. Because before that, he quickly discussed the features of the other races. And I'm not going to go into that. The last quote. The inhabitant of the temperate parts of the world, still talking about white people, of course, above all, the central part has a more beautiful body, works harder, is more jocular, more controlled in his passions, more intelligent than any other race of people in the world. That is why, at all points in time, these peoples have all amazed the southern lands with their arts and weapons. I would like you to focus on arts and weapons here, because that creates a nice connection to what we're studying, right? What notion comes up here? Yes?
Arts being various practical subjects, metalworking. I think that's just how Rousseau defined it in his essays. Weapons, I think, just in general, just being proficiency in battle, which was emphasized by Rousseau as well.
Thank you. So, what I'm thinking about in particular, well, there's a list of things I'm thinking about. First of all, empire, right? This sounds like kind of a justification for empire, both in cultural terms, right, arts, and in military, political terms, the weapons, right, conquering other populations. So what happens to freedom here as an Enlightenment ideal? What happens to the dignity of human nature? Who are the people that will have human nature, by the way? And what happens to the claim, or what do we do with the claim that individuals are mainly responsible for their minority? It doesn't seem that there's a talk of oppression or other kinds of causes, possible causes for people's minority. So I'm going to quickly proceed to the next question. What do philosophers do when an author that's considered as important and foundational as Kant is and has been? What do we do when an author like this also, and not on the side, but importantly, has these kinds of ideas and gives intellectual dignity to these ideas? So some would discard Kant's racism and sexism by saying it's an anomaly, an exception. He happened to be racist and sexist, but that was just, his time. As if we didn't have any of those problems now, by the way, right? So I've seen mostly two options in philosophical discussions of this particular problem. Some people think we can keep the valuable ideas in Kant's work and isolate them from the rest. So they think that Kant's racism and sexism, do not affect his other ideas, the ones we consider valuable, right? Others still think that racism and sexism inform Kant's thought deeply, and that we therefore need to entirely rethink his texts and their role in the narrative of our modernity, right? So I'm going to stop here just because I want to leave some room for your questions or your suggestions, right? Because we're all dealing with these works, right? I didn't touch on Rousseau, but you probably noticed there's a lot of racist stuff there. There's a lot of prejudice there as well. So how would we deal with that? What do we do? How do we balance or negotiate our relation between those ideas and the new ones? Yes?
I was saying that what we could do is that we can look like, so we see there's some ideas that we feel might be valid, others that we feel like maybe should be dismissed. Because I feel that we should try to analyze it as a whole and see, okay, there's this racism, there's this sexism. See, how does this play into his other ideas that we see as more valid? So that then we can see, basically try to get the core of his ideas and understand how it all ties together and sort of how he thought as a human.
Great. That actually is a great suggestion, and it's close to what's being proposed as a dialectical approach to this problem. So trying to see how the two aspects interact and inform each other. Thank you. Any other comments or questions, either for me or Daniel? Yeah. Yeah, and part of the problem, right, is exactly that he doesn't follow his own suggestions, right? He doesn't hold up to his own standards. However, what do we do with that, right? Do we throw everything away? Or do we use his own standards against him in order to try to further develop our positions, right? So,
Which is, just for the folks who are going to be watching at home. So basically the proposal here, what I want to make sure we understand is there's a way to proceed where we distinguish between what Kant, the individual, the human, who was racist and sexist and also classist, claimed, and whether or not Kant's system, independently of the person, has the resources to provide a critique of Kant, the man himself. I think there's a pretty clear way to do that, and Valentina has already sketched that out for us. But in philosophy, we're asking this kind of question very often because the history of philosophy is marred by racists and sexists and classists. What do we do when we encounter a thinker that is this incredibly powerful in terms of the system that he or she presents, but the person, him or herself, has these deeply problematic issues going on? So, any other questions about Kant or philosophical methodology broadly, your reactions? We would really welcome any kind of question or contribution that you might have. Yes, sir.
I think that's part of the reason we still study Kant and Rousseau is because it's not just that we want to understand, well, obviously we want to understand their viewpoints, but we don't want to take those on as our own. We want to develop them more because though a lot of their work is marred in hypocrisy, Rousseau hated despots, but often enjoyed the patronage of people considered oligarchical or of the monarchy. Yet we look for those little sparks of genius that sort of help us understand what Enlightenment actually is. So they were onto something for sure, but we need to develop it further in order to make a better interpretation.
Great, thank you. Any other questions, comments, issues that we can address? Yes, sir.
I think like my sense of the argument is that Kant preaches that you should, kind of go against kind of like the narrative and question what he himself is, like prejudice, right? That's kind of the inconsistency. But like I feel like it's kind of like a fair assumption that like Kant reaches prejudice when he's falling prey to society rather than like he reasoned to these prejudices. So I think it'd be more constructive to kind of deconstruct his arguments for prejudice and try out the whole thing because of this reason.
Yes, so what the gentleman up front is suggesting is the distinction between Kant being a kind of subject to his time versus Kant providing a rational argument for racism, sexism, and classism. These are two different interpretations. Either is viable, but I think the one that you suggested is his using reason to justify these problematic positions is a promising position for which he could. So we're up for time. I'd like to thank everyone for being here today.